I'm Leonard S. Marcus, the author of Comix Confidential, a book of Q&A interviews with graphic novelists. In America, at the turn of the century, families, everybody would read the comics in the newspapers. And then in the 1930s, a new format came along, comic books, and they cost 10 cents and were sold in magazine racks and cigar stores, places like that. Kids could buy them with their own money. By then, the public librarians in America saw themselves as the judges of the good for reading for children. They thought the comics were subliterary and that their stories were kind of sensational. So they discouraged children from reading them, and that idea rubbed off on lots of parents. But the great thing was, of course, that kids could afford to buy them with their own money, and they could do it in secret. So millions of kids read them anyhow. Whether or not the adult world wanted children to read comics, they read them anyway, in staggering numbers, really, millions every month. Some of those children grew up to be artists, and they had it within them to continue the tradition one way or another. During the 50s and 60s, the time of beatniks and the counterculture, some of those young artists started something called underground comics in New York and San Francisco. And these were not for children. They spelled comics C-O-M-I-X, and they really were kind of X-rated in the sense that they were meant to be as shocking as possible and to be as subversive as possible. Well, from out of that group came Art Spiegelman. And when Art Spiegelman created the 2-volume memoir Mouse, which was based on his father's experiences during the Holocaust, which was certainly not intended primarily for young readers, it was transformative because people couldn't ignore the fact that this was a great work of art. It won the Pulitzer Prize, so it had the official, culture's stamp of approval. And once that happened, and even really a little bit before that happened, the generation coming up who had loved comics all along thought, well, why can't I do that too? And the internet played a big role in this because the first people had no hope of making a living at it, so they just posted their stories online, or they drew them by hand and stapled them together and sold them to each other or gave them to each other at comics conventions. And it was just something that people were doing for the love of it. But then, after Spiegelman, it all became legitimized, and publishers started looking for these people and offering them contracts. And there was a very distinctive turning point in 2006 when a few of the major trade publishers sort of scooped up a number of these artists and began publishing graphic novels for children and teenagers. My goal really was to bring to light for more people the wide range of and talent in the comics world today. So I looked for artists who were doing like serious ones, historical fiction ones. Humor has become a possibility in graphic novels in the last few years. The artists come from many different directions. Some were painters, others were cartoonists for The New Yorker, like Harry Bliss. And so it's this sort of great convergence of talent from many directions. These days, I would say that they just represent another form of storytelling. We've become more aware than past generations of concept now known as visual literacy, that looking at pictures is actually reading pictures. And the brain is doing its work, and it's a slightly different form of work than when we're reading words. So in that sense, it's probably a cognitively richer experience than any other kind of literature because it's a bilingual literature. Well, one message would be that graphic novels have turned out to be the answer to everyone's worries about literacy, because kids who don't see themselves as readers or who might be described as reluctant readers turn out to, by and large, be attracted to comics. And So those books can be either the primary reading experience that a young person has while they're still in school, or it might turn out to be a gateway experience to read books like War and Peace. Not everybody has to read War and Peace, but comics are a great introduction and experience both of literature and art. So that's part of it. We go to art museums. So it's not true that kids outgrow pictures because we live with them for all our lives, and so for anyone who might be reluctant to accept graphic novels as being on the same level as, books with blocks of type, I would just say that, from a larger perspective, they're really part of the mainstream of our culture going back hundreds of years. I was very struck by what a community has been formed by the graphic novelists. They are in touch with each other online as they're working. They're very generous to each other. I think it's partly because they started out, for the most part, as underdogs, as people who thought no one would ever really embrace their work. And now that some of them are having, really significant success, it's just something that has caught hold and been recognized. And it's sort of nice that it's happened. Really wonderful that it's happened.